Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of the United States and the Cold War. In the previous lectures, we talked about the nature of the relationship between the United States and Russia and the long-standing rivalry between the two. And at the end of those reflections, I noted that the real question was not so much how did the wartime allies of the United States and Russia become enemies during the Cold War, but how did they ever become allies in the first place? So in this lecture, we'll continue in that vein and discuss the nature of that tenuous alliance between the Russians and the Americans during World War II. As I described in the previous lectures, there was plenty of deep-seated mistrust and even dislike between the Americans and Russians long before World War II. It was only the necessity of war that drove the two together in an alliance. Both sides viewed the other as a threat, in some ways even more of a threat than the rising German Nazi threat. To the Americans and other Europeans, rising socialist and communist movements threatened the status quo in their countries. And as we've described previously, the possibility of the global spread of communism was exacerbated in those movements. Up until the mid-1930s, many in the United States and in the UK believed the Soviet Union was a greater threat than Nazi Germany, and they were focused in their efforts there. Stalin had similar concerns from his end and worried that the Allied approach of appeasement was pushing the Germans potentially into conflict with the Soviet Union. And so Stalin sought to ease that threat by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August of 1939, in which Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union declared they would not invade the other. Both sides probably understood this was not going to be a permanent and lasting agreement. But Stalin was hoping to buy some time to strengthen his own country, expecting that at some point the Germans would invade. And as I've mentioned, the other Allied nations really hadn't given him any reason to suspect that they were much better than Hitler. It didn't work for long, of course. Hitler launched his invasion of Russia in June of 1941. Even at that point, Americans were unsure which side to support, and Harry Truman voiced that concern, as I'll mention in just a moment. Still, it was Hitler who posed the most immediate threat to the American way of life and democracy abroad, and so the United States supported the Soviets, sending millions of dollars and ultimately billions of dollars in Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets as they fought against the Germans. Still, this was hardly a warm alliance or friendship. Harry Truman, at that time vice president, expressed these doubts with this shocking statement in 1941. If we see that Germany is winning, we should help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And that way let them kill as many as possible, although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances. These are hardly the words of someone who views this as a close alliance. In the early stages of the war, the Allies did little to endear themselves with the Soviets in the way the war was being waged. After the German invasion of Russia, enormous casualties were exacted upon the Russians, and they endured incredible suffering under the attack from Germany. The Soviets were annoyed at having to bear the brunt of the Axis alliance since 1941, and they pleaded with the West to open a second front in Europe, which didn't happen until the D-Day invasion in June of 1944. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt from the West repeatedly promised that they would open a second front, at times in a series of conferences that I'll be discussing in the following lecture. Indeed, the other Allies did launch attacks through northern Africa and into Italy in 1943, which Churchill and Roosevelt declared formed a sort of second front. But they didn't launch an open attack until the D-Day invasion itself, which caused Stalin great consternation. Throughout the war, there was mutual distrust, even among these so-called allies. The United States and Great Britain didn't tell Stalin about breakthroughs such as the decoding of German ciphers with the Ultra experiment. Stalin suspected that the West would stand by and watch Germany defeat the Russians, right up until the invasion of Normandy, and Truman's quote, which I mentioned before, indicates that he wasn't entirely wrong. However, a mutual interest in the need to defeat Germany was enough to keep the alliance intact. This began to change when FDR died with victory in the war not far in the future. His vice president, Harry Truman, was not skilled in foreign affairs, and we'll describe his sort of clunky version of diplomacy in future lectures. Truman failed to inform Stalin of the decision to drop the atomic bomb, which occurred not long after the Potsdam Conference, which again I'll be discussing in the next lecture. Stalin really never overcame what he perceived as a grave slight in that oversight. Eventually, the Allies did open a second front with the D-Day invasion. After that, the war began to disintegrate for Hitler and the Germans. They were now pushed back on both sides, and the Second Front had its desired effect of compelling Hitler and the Germans to pull their forces to the west to defend against the American and British advance. There were still significant issues to settle and decisions to be made. The most critical, in terms of the post-war world, involved the advance of the Russian army. In practical terms, Stalin understood that after the war it would be very difficult to take away territory that the Red Army had occupied. Thus, Stalin was determined that his army should advance as fast and as far as possible. And the two armies engaged in what was described as a race to Berlin in the later stages of the war. There was also the fate of Poland, a tragic story. Late in the war, as the Germans retreated, the Poles in Warsaw launched an uprising and declared their independence. The Germans then attacked the Poles, determined to squash this resistance. The Red Army had advanced as far as Warsaw and waited across the river while the rebels were steadily destroyed by the Germans. Stalin claimed they needed to rest and consolidate their position, but essentially the Soviets took this opportunity to see resistance in Warsaw crushed by the Germans. After the uprising was destroyed, the Red Army continued its advance, only now through a beaten and demoralized Poland. The advance of the Red Army was also accompanied by brutality and especially rape. New evidence indicates that as many as 2 million German women were raped by men in the Red Army, with no indication of any remorse or attempt to stop such behavior. Obviously, such tactics contributed to great resentment among Eastern Europeans and Germans regarding the Russians, and would again reconfirm the tenuous nature of this American and Soviet alliance. These are the words of Joseph Stalin in describing that process of the advance of the Red Army late in the war. This war is not as in the past. Whoever occupies a territory also imposes on it his own social system as far as his army can reach. And so indeed the Red Army raced to Berlin, achieved the conquest of Berlin, and stretched out into the countryside on the other side in the last stages of the war in Europe. So this was a key element in the shifting of the end of World War II into the early stages of the Cold War, a process that I'll continue describing in the next lecture. as we talk about a series of wartime conferences that determined the state of the world in the aftermath of the war.